From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
The biggest reason I wrote this was to point out sort of systemic issues that have to be fixed. This whole inspector general system, I think, has to be destroyed and rebuilt because it right now it basically serves the interests of the agencies. It has to be separated from those agencies so that it's not just doing the bidding of the agency leaders.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. And that was Dr. Mark Moyar. He is the William P. Harris Chair of Military History here at Hillsdale College, and his brand new book is just out, Masters of Corruption, How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency, the book based on his experiences as a political appointee in the Trump administration. Dr. Moyar, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
It is a fantastic book, one that reads like a suspense novel, but the facts are all too true, as you'll tell us throughout our conversation today. This involves your time serving, as we mentioned, during the Trump administration at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And before we get to that, the process of how you landed there is how the book begins. And you explain that as President Trump took office and these positions were being filled, that some of the people in charge of selecting political appointees purposefully rejected candidates deemed to be supportive of Trump, the opposite of what people who voted for Donald Trump likely expected. How does that happen under the watch of someone like President Trump?
Yes, that's a great question. Trump was not really expecting to win, as we know, and so the administration wasn't fully prepared to pick people, and they selected some senior officials who Trump himself later acknowledged were not the right people. And some of them were closely wed to the D.C. establishment that President Trump had vowed to destroy. And so a lot of them were very suspicious of Trump and his policies. And so people who expressed any support for him, myself included, were deemed suspicious. And a lot of, at the Department of Defense, you actually had Secretary of Defense explicitly saying he wanted apolitical individuals for these positions, which is just doesn't make any sense.
Eventually, you end up at the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, as we'll refer to it through the rest of the conversation, in the Office of Civilian Military Cooperation. And you talk about your first days, your training. There's training about privilege, but no training for waste, fraud, abuse, and essentially how to confront corruption if you see it. What's the problem you saw and how people are trained as they enter the government system?
Yes, well, by the time I'm in this training, the administration's been there more than a year, and yet you have this training on privilege. We do a so-called privilege walk, which is a left-wing indoctrination tool. And so this is another indication of the difficulty of getting the Trump administration to impose its policies. It's actually not until year 4 that they officially ban all of this sort of stuff. And at the time, I didn't fully understand the waste, fraud, and abuse problem. I thought I was mainly going in there as a sort of policy expert who was knowledgeable about development and defense issues. But as it turned out, the problems of waste, fraud, and abuse end up consuming most of my time.
Mark Moyar is with us. His book, Masters of Corruption, How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency. One of the questions we'll answer through the course of the conversation is people look and say, President Trump had 4 years. Why weren't more changes made? Why wasn't the swamp drained? We're going to answer some of that through the course of the conversation. But I think we have to pause momentarily to talk about another book that you wrote called Oppose Any Foe, because to understand what happens to you in the span of working for USAID and then not working for USAID, we need to understand Oppose Any Foe and what you wrote and why it becomes a source of controversy.
Yes, I wrote that book in 2016. I submitted to the government for review because I had signed a 30-day non-disclosure agreement from having worked in special operations previously. And unfortunately, they kept delaying and delaying and delaying. And I gave them far beyond the original amount. Finally, I went to them and under the provision of federal regulations said, I'm going to publish this in a few months. And so you now have an opportunity to respond or take a court action. They didn't do anything. And so they had a whole year to review this, never said there was anything objectionable in it. And it will only be 2 years later that they will suddenly come back after I've reported corruption and raised this issue.
Yeah, remember that story. We'll return to it in a moment. You begin your work at USAID, and I don't know what you expected. Maybe you can tell us what you thought you'd find when you arrived, but what you did find was a lot of people not doing the job, a lot of people involved in, say, shady and corrupt, just straight out corrupt activities. When you arrived at USAID, what did you consider your job, your mission, and how did you approach that job?
Yes, well, many of us, including me, were initially appointed as senior advisors because they didn't know us very well and they didn't understand exactly where everyone was going to fit. So for the first period, I did not have any supervisory responsibilities. But then as soon as I'm put into a supervisory role, about 6 months into my time there, I start receiving all these reports that there's been corruption going on within the office from other staff. And I went to the human resources leadership and told them about this. And they asked what I wanted to do. And I said, well, we need to dig into this. And they said, well, we commend you for that because most of the managers here simply avoid that because you can get into trouble. And turns out I did get into trouble, but thinking I was doing the right thing, I went ahead and we did go after some corrupt people, but it ended up provoking a big backlash.
As you begin that process and report people who need to be reported, you're warned, and I can't remember who warned you, but someone said, are you sure you want to do this? Because people will lose their jobs. And you talk about how you approach that and why you decided to push forward despite the fact there were going to be serious consequences or should have been serious consequences for people that you were working with.
Yes, that was a big turning point, and it did make me think through this carefully because losing a job is a big deal, especially in the federal government. And by this point, I'd been around long enough to be cautious about doing anything that could cause perhaps serious harm to somebody. But and I thought through it and I thought back to the great moral thinkers that have influenced me, especially Dostoevsky and Aristotle are the two I cite. And we do have an obligation. Partly you have this legal obligation as part of your job, but there's also a moral and ethical obligation and an obligation to God that you need to look out not just for yourself, but for the people of this country, for your staff. And so if you do have people who are flagrantly abusing their power, you do have a responsibility to take action. And if that includes severe punishment, if the charges warrant it, then you go ahead. And so I went ahead and pushed it. And I ultimately was not the arbiter of who got punished, but one individual was forced to leave the agency as a result of this.
Mark Moyar with us. Masters of Corruption is his new book, How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency. So that process is underway. You elevate and promote some people in the organization, USAID, you think are doing a great job. You're trying to sort of fix the problems you see as you enter. In the midst of this, things start happening. And I should mention, at the introduction of the book, you list these 10, what you call twists of fate, but you could also sort of see them as lessons learned through the course of your time. So we'll refer to some of these as we talk about what happened. But after this process begins, your computer is taken away. A brand new computer is taken away, which is odd. And this begins the process of payback, I guess we'll call it, for you turning in those people who you believe to have been acting in a corrupt fashion inside USAID. And this is where it's written in a very suspenseful way. It reads like a John Grisham novel. I mean, these things are happening inside of this governmental organization that people outside don't know. It's confidential. These things aren't reported in every day. Far later they are. So as this process begins and you feel the push back from inside USAID and inside the government, do you see what's happening before it happens? Are you aware of what might be happening to you in your career?
Well, I get these signals, and so the seizure of my computer takes place, and it won't be till much later when their investigations happen that we find out what exactly was going on. But it turns out there had been people trying to throw lots of different accusations against me, and some of this certainly was instigated by the individual who ended up getting kicked out. But we also have there were other senior career bureaucrats who had their own agendas. And I'd like to point out most of the career employees I met were not subversives or trying to undermine the government, but there was this significant minority. And so there's also another guy named Rob Jenkins who, in addition to being aligned with these corrupt folks, is also angling to get this very senior leadership job, which seemed to be the job I was going to get, which usually goes to a political appointee. But he was sort of as I call him, sort of the godfather of the civil service within the agency. And so he's also has this personal agenda that he's going to try to get me out so he can take control of this new bureau, which has a $300 million annual budget.
Eventually, we found out there are allegations. One, they took your computer because there was an allegation you were writing a book while working at USAID. That was eventually, kicked aside. The one allegation that is the spur is this allegation that there was confidential classified material published in the book we mentioned previously, Oppose Any Foe. And so that domino leads to your security clearance being in limbo, which leads to you being unable to do the job at USAID because you need a security clearance. And this is where sort of the crux of the book happens, where what happens with your security clearance, how it happens, who tells who what. I don't want you to tell the whole story because it's in the book, but how does this controversy and this discussion about your security clearance sort of pave the way for everything else that happens?
Yeah, so it turns out to be very convoluted because the arguments made at the time will then be revised, and as public scrutiny, or congressional scrutiny, I should say, comes to the matter, the agency keeps changing its position. But the way they used to get me out is that they claim that supposedly there is evidence, but then they backtrack on this too about whether there's actually evidence. But what I'm told is that simply because this accusation was made by a two-star general whose name still remains hidden, that we must accept this as gospel. So that was actually the language used. And so then that was used by various bureaucrats to claim I couldn't be employed. Now, later also, the agency backtracks on that and says, well, we could have given you a job that didn't require clearance, but that's only after Senator Charles Grassley has started to grill them. But that is used to say, to fire me and it's done in a way that skirts all sorts of due process protections.
Right. You're never directly told through this entire tale exactly the portions of the book that they consider to be releasing or leaking, which a word you hate, as you mentioned in the book, classified material. You're never allowed to confront the accusers. You're never really allowed to even present your side of the story other than in sending emails or written missives to people who are above you.
Yeah, so they use all sorts of bureaucratic sleight of hand. And so initially I'm told that they don't yet have the evidence and that I will have a chance to defend myself, that there's a due process and there's an appeal process. But then this lawyer who is known within the agency as the unethical ethics attorney, he convinces them convinces others in the agency that, they can just go ahead and fire me because he thinks this is a foregone conclusion that I'm going to lose my clearance. But so in doing that, then they actually deprive me of the appeal process and due process. And then later on, fast forward a couple years down the road, they later try this again. But then when we get to the due process part and we say, okay, turn over whatever evidence you have, two agencies say, well, that belongs to another agency. And so 5 years later, we're still not able to find out what the supposed evidence was or who the accuser was.
Mark Moyar is with us. His book, Masters of Corruption, How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency, talking about his time as a political appointee at the U.S. Agency for International Development, trying to fight corruption, trying to replace people who should not be serving in those roles, and the pushback that he received. One of these twists of fate, the lessons learned, individuals involved in reviewing your case were not trustworthy, and senior officials who should have stood up for you would only watch out for their own hides. Portions of this book, when you read it, will absolutely infuriate you. And this is one at the top of the list, in that people who are doing the right thing and trying to clean up government, trying to identify people who are doing wrong, are not supported essentially at any level above you, because, as you write, they're looking out for themselves.
Yeah, and this goes back into this problem of who was originally selected for the Trump administration, because what happens is you get people selecting officials who are not really committed to either the public interest or to the administration. They're looking out for themselves. They appoint friends and family to positions. And so the political appointee who has the greatest say in all of this is sort of epitomizes the swamp. Bonnie Glick, she's actually married to the very top lobbyist for the development community, and she's doing things in her job to abet this individual. So I said, part of the problem certainly is the entrenched bureaucrats, but you also have some political appointees who are derelict in their duty. She ends up getting fired very near the end of the administration. Again, most of these problems are recognized too late, but hopefully, the next time the Republicans are in power, and perhaps in 2025, this sort of experience will help people understand you've got to be very careful at the beginning who you select.
Mm-hmm. Retaliation against whistleblowers, and you're in an unusual circumstance. When people think about whistleblowers, it's usually sort of pointing upward. And in some ways, your whistles were pointed downward toward people who were working underneath you at USAID. Did that complicate matters when it came to your ability to access protections that should be afforded to people who are blowing the whistle on government corruption? Yeah,
and that's one of the big misperceptions about whistleblowers. People usually think they're the very low-level employees, but technically it refers to somebody who faces retaliation for reporting waste, fraud, and abuse. And one of the things I learned, which I didn't understand before, is that it's actually oftentimes managers who are, and middle managers who are the victims of the retaliation, because they think, now I'm in a position of authority, I have some clout in the organization, and I have a responsibility to report on this. But it turns out oftentimes the senior management views them as a threat and is willing to throw them under the bus. And so that was occasionally that was an excuse used to question whether I could get whistleblower protection. There's also a lot of they came up with every sort of crazy excuse. Probably the craziest that was used several times was that I had voluntarily resigned, which was, they tried to claim that because I had been fired, and then a lawyer advised me to submit a resignation several days later, which I did, but there's nothing voluntary about that resignation, and we have clear documentation. But nonetheless, they came up with all sorts of Orwellian excuses to try to deprive me of the protections that go along with whistleblowing.
Mark Moyar with us, his book, Masters of Corruption, How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency. You should have also perhaps found some solace, some assistance in the roles of the inspectors general, not just for USAID, but higher up inside Department of Defense. You didn't find any of that. You received all this paperwork that essentially showed these sham investigations into what happened to you at USAID, the payback, the retaliation you faced for being a whistleblower. Why why didn't the inspectors general act more vociferously to protect someone like you?
Yeah, well, this is, and particularly USAID, it's a really sad story, and I learned much of this sort of after the fact. But shortly before I joined USAID, they'd had a big crisis within the Inspector General's office, because whistleblowers had informed Congress and the media that the Inspector General was fudging reports to try to curry favor with the agency leadership, and that's not how the Inspector Generals are supposed to work. They're supposed to be sort of independent. But what we found here and in other places is you have people who are not very morally upright, who are in it for themselves again. And so they are more concerned about protecting their interests and protecting the interests of the agency. And so they have a pretty poor record at USAID and elsewhere of protecting whistleblowers.
We'll continue in a moment with Mark Moyar. His book is Masters of Corruption, How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency. You can find that at hillsdale.edu/podcast. This show, the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, and all the shows on the Hillsdale College Podcast Network are listener-supported. One of the ways you can help is by joining the Liberty and Learning Society. That's our exclusive monthly giving group here at Hillsdale College. By joining, you'll help make shows like this one possible far into the future. And joining is simple and easy. You can also cancel anytime you have to. All you do is visit hillsdale.edu/monthly and complete the secure online donation form. hillsdale.edu/monthly to join the Liberty and Learning Society and help support the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, as well as all the audio found on the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. Become a part of the Liberty and Learning Society today at hillsdale.edu/monthly. That's hillsdale.edu/monthly. And I thank you. We continue our conversation with Mark Moyar, his new book, Masters of Corruption, How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency, based on his firsthand experiences as a political appointee in the Trump administration, trying to call out corruption inside the government. For the first time, the story is told here in the book. And you can find Masters of Corruption at hillsdale.edu/podcast. Mark, we mentioned the security clearance question earlier in the conversation, and eventually there's a resolution. And the resolution is that they say this was wrong. There was nothing in the book that should have resulted in your security clearance being taken away, being suspended, which is great news for you. You get an offer from the Department of Defense to serve in the waning days of the Trump administration. You're actually called to begin work, show up one day, and they say, wait, there's another problem. Hang on. And it turns out that it's another review or another black mark on the security clearance. So even after you're cleared of the initial allegation against you, there are still, let's just say it, there are still forces inside government who are working to prevent you from working again in government.
Yes, and we do know that USAID went back to the Defense Department after they heard that my clearance was there, and then they convinced somebody, and we know they had friends there, that, and now when they come back this time, they don't actually say you published classified information, I think because by now it's clear that it's not going to hold water. So then they claim you disobeyed a warning from an official. This gets to the a broader problem, this idea of the administrative state. They're basically saying what a federal official says counts for more than a contract or the Constitution, because what this official was saying essentially is we're trying to say we have unlimited authority to censor, which is unconstitutional and is not consistent with the non-disclosure agreement. But that's the allegation they throw at me. And then so we try to get them, at that point we say, okay, well, turn over your supporting evidence, and then they fall back on bureaucratic doublespeak, and then we have to file a lawsuit to get it, and that lawsuit is actually still in the courts right now.
Mark Moyar with us, his book, Masters of Corruption. There are bad guys in this book, and the names are named, and you can follow their actions throughout Masters of Corruption. But there are good guys, too, and perhaps chief among them is U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, who you are able to get the attention of. He is able to do some things inside the U.S. Senate. He is able to get some unredacted documents to you and to the public, and he pushes this forward in the U.S. Senate. What kind of help did Chuck Grassley give to you, and how did he help advance your case?
Yes, and he's long been a champion of whistleblower, probably the greatest whistleblower champion in the Congress. So he found out about the case after there was an article in the press, and he was very aggressive in going to USAID and DOD and saying, here's some questions about things that don't seem right. Send me answers. And so for a time, USAID and DOD were forced to respond. And so in their answers, sometimes they actually, in several cases, basically lied to him, and as I document. And then there's other cases they have to sort of admit things that contradict what they said earlier. So he exposes a lot and sheds light on a lot of things that happened. But then in 2021, after the control in Senate changes hands, USAID, which is now run by Samantha Power, says, you know what, Senator Grassley, you're no longer a committee chair, and we don't feel we have to answer to you. Now, this is a big point of contention in Congress still is, do the federal agencies actually have to answer to anybody? Mm-hmm. But so far, this practice has continued, and so they have been stalling. And so we did then go and talk with some people on the Democratic side to see if they would help us, and we thought they would, but it being the swamp, they haven't really stepped up for us yet. So there's still Republicans in Congress who were hoping to help us see this through.
Mark Moyar's book, Masters of Corruption, How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency. I mentioned it reads like a movie script. There are all these twists and turns. In a movie script, the good guy wins, the bad guys are deposed. That is not the way Masters of Corruption ends. You don't get your job back. You're not hailed as a hero in Washington. We like you here at Hillsdale, of course. And the bad guys, you can look them up on Google, still have jobs in the same organization that they have for a long, long time now. Where do you stand, presently in terms of your case, and what is left to adjudicate?
Yes, well, we still have some ongoing complaints going through the government. We have another whistleblower complaint that we're planning to send to the Department of Defense after, these things all take many, years to happen, although you found bureaucracy can make things happen quickly when they want to, but they also can string things out for years. But we're still trying to work with some inspectors general. And I do think if Trump wins the next election, that will make things much easier because we've found the Biden administration officials will generally stand behind the bureaucrats. The bureaucrats are overwhelmingly supportive of the Democrats. But if you can get some Republicans back in there, they can start digging in. And as I said, there's still a lot of facts that the government's been able to conceal from us. So hopefully we can get that and get some more cooperation, perhaps a new inspector general. But the biggest reason I wrote this was to point out sort of systemic issues that have to be fixed. I mean, for this whole inspector general system, I think has to be destroyed and rebuilt because it right now it basically serves the interests of the agencies, and it has to be separated from those agencies so that it's not just doing the bidding of the agency leaders.
In the end, in the conclusion, there are a number of ways you suggest to help in the future. One of those is ending this abuse of security clearances as weapons. This comes up multiple times in the book with how your security clearance is put on hold, is revoked, is given back, is revoked again. It doesn't take much, apparently, to make this happen. There was someone who actually sat on a security clearance of yours, did not submit it for approval for months on end to sort of gum up the works in terms of your position. How do you go about changing that system so that it can't be used in that manner?
There's already some fairly good legislation. In some of these areas, you need to change the legislation. And you can certainly strengthen it, because one thing I found, too, is that bureaucrats will come up with the craziest verbal gymnastics to try to skirt language. So there's certain areas where you can make it even more explicit. But you also, in the case of security clearances, they need to modify the legislation to allow individuals to sue for this type of retaliation. Because one of the things I didn't know is that even in cases where certain things are prohibited, you need to have what's called a cause of action to be able to sue. And so you don't have that right now with a lot of security clearance abuses.
The subhead on the title, How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency. We haven't talked a lot about that specifically because I think the story is even bigger than that particular point. But when people do say, why didn't Trump do more in 4 years? Why didn't he drain the swamp? Why don't we see more changes? How do you think Masters of Corruption helps explain to people why that ended up being the case? I do talk at some length about the bureaucracy itself is, and this is not new, but it's certainly was hostile to Trump and many of its members, and we've seen plenty of evidence of that. And also, it tends to
drag its feet on things and resist change. So that's one part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is that the leadership, the politically appointed leadership, was not up to the task. And so, there's talk of, we can sort of tear down the whole civil service, and, that perhaps it would make sense, but that's a very difficult thing to do. But I think in the shorter term, and certainly for the next administration, if Trump's reelected, the focus needs to be on getting leaders who are dedicated, committed, because what a lot of these leaders did, including in my agency, is they weren't really there to impose their will or impose the White House's will. They were there to, pad their own resumes and get good jobs for when they left the administration. And so those kind of people let the bureaucracy basically do what it wanted to do. So next time around, I think job number one to drain the swamp is to get in the right political appointees who are there, not to gain favor with bureaucrats or get post-administration jobs, but are there to make sure that the policies of the White House are implemented.
And I think a point that you make, and you can disagree with me, it's your book, is that it is important to be explicit about political appointees being political. Because when some of the appointees were looked at for Trump positions, there was this is a nonpartisan area. But I think one of the lessons of your book is that they have to be political appointees in political places, because this is all politics in the end.
Yeah, that's right. And it is a little bit laughable, too, because you heard, especially from establishment media, politicians, that we really need to have people who are not really political partisans. But then you look at the Biden administration, they're full of liberal and left-wing partisans.
Well, Samantha Power is now USAID chief.
Yes, she is still the head of USAID. And, there was also a case where Secretary of Defense Mattis wanted to appoint Michelle Flournoy, who was a Democratic partisan, as his deputy, and thinking somehow she was apolitical, which is just ridiculous. And so, even defense, too, because sometimes people think of national security as being nonpartisan, but the truth is there are parts of it you could certainly view that way. But when you're talking about, imposing, paying for transgender surgery, things like that, there's certainly lots of partisan disagreements. And if you don't have people who agree with the political views of the president, you're not going to have your agenda implemented.
I think it's a very important book for people to read, Masters of Corruption, How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency, and Mark Moyar's story of service at USAID. He tried to attack corruption and the retaliation that he faced. Again, it's Masters of Corruption. Mark Moyar, the author, also William P. Harris Chair in Military History at Hillsdale College. You could also find his previous books on the Vietnam War. And heck, you could also find Oppose Any Foe as well, and read it in full. Mark, thank you so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Yes, Scott, it's been great to be with you.
Up next, we talk with Jason Peters from Hillsdale's English department as we discuss Wendell Berry and his essays on technology. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Great books, great people, and great ideas. Knowledge of these things is critical to becoming a well-educated human being. That's why I'd like to tell you about an easy and enjoyable way for you to listen and learn whenever and wherever you want. And that's through the Hillsdale Dialogues. If you haven't heard about the Dialogues, once a week, Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn joins radio veteran Hugh Hewitt to discuss topics of enduring relevance. From time to time, they also talk about current events, but always with an eye toward more fundamental truths. And they want you to listen in, to join a conversation like no other. The Hillsdale Dialogues are posted every Friday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu, or wherever you get your audio. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram.
Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network for all audio from Hillsdale College. It's at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Dr. Jason Peters, Associate Professor of English here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Peters, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
Continuing our conversations here on American author and writer Wendell Berry, this time we focus on his thoughts and works on the subject of technology. He wrote an essay back in 1987, which is titled, Why I Am Not Going to Buy a Computer. It might be an entry point for a lot of people into the world of Berry. Why does this one particular essay loom so large?
I think it looms so large because so many people are looking for reasons not to have to read any more Wendell Berry's stuff. It's the thing that people who don't know much about him know about him. And when I was a young teacher, I made the mistake of making that an undergraduate's first introduction to Berry. I wouldn't do that now. I'm a little smarter now. But it touched a nerve. As he said, it touched a technological nerve, and it set off some of the techno-fundamentalists and made them pretty angry. He was picking on the big one, right? The computer. It might be the same thing now as picking on the smartphone. Yeah, it was a big deal. It was published first in the New England Breadloaf Quarterly, and then reprinted in Harper's. There was an avalanche of letters that came into Harper's, not very many of them favorable, although some of them were. And so Berry was given the opportunity to respond to them, which he did in a pretty severe way. I mean, he didn't pull any punches on that. In that essay, he made some interesting points. You know, there are technological innovations that are going to have consequences that we apparently think are just the cost of doing business. They're reasonable trade-offs. And he doesn't think this is true. And this goes back to his thinking about technological innovations in farming. Mm-hmm. When all that was done, he wrote a second essay called Feminism, the Body and the Machine, which I think to this day is one of his best essays. He was trying to make what I think is a very plain, simple, and reasonable point, which is that when you introduce a new technology, there are going to be consequences in the social sphere. And he did not want the new technology interrupting already good things that already exist. In his case, it was the working relationship between himself and his wife, mm-hmm. whom he calls his best critic. And the backlash, of course, was, well, your wife could be free to go do more meaningful things like be the flunky to some boss. But he thinks that the things that you buy should be fixable by people of ordinary intelligence, or if not, fixable by shops close to home. They shouldn't do ecological damage if you can help it. They shouldn't affect the health of the community if that's possible. And so he just said, he called this a tiny dissent. I don't want one of these things, so I'm not going to get one. And wow, paid a good price for it.
So he calls it a tiny dissent, but I'm sure a question like this pops up. It has come up in our conversation of Neil Postman as well. Essentially, and I'll ask this before we get into the details, but is he a Luddite, right? That's something that is asked about him. Does he reject all technological advances? Yeah,
this is one of the things that his critics could be answered on if they just read one more thing. He loves talking on the telephone. He's got a radio. He has admitted that there are certain kinds of advantages that come with tractors, mm-hmm. and some implements that are not drawn by horses. But yeah, he's a Luddite, but he's a Luddite in this respect, and he's been very clear about this. The Luddites were weavers who objected to being replaced by machines. They objected to having their livelihoods taken away from them, and they smashed the machines. They didn't hurt people, but they were willing to destroy the machines that were destroying their livelihood. And Berry says, I would willingly put sugar in the gas tank of that machine if it's going to, those weren't his words, but if it's going to affect the health of my community. I choose my community over a machine or over technology. Seems to me it'd be a perfectly reasonable position to take. So in that respect, yeah, he's a Luddite.
You mentioned he has these this list of standards before adopting new technology to clear these standards. The 9th point on this list says it should not replace or disrupt anything good that already exists, and this includes family and community relationships. Reading it clearly seems like a pretty high bar to clear. What are the types of technologies that would be able to clear a bar like that? Does not disrupt anything good that already exists, including family and community relationships.
He's illustrated the point by recurring to the Amish, whom he admires and respects, and he says that they've got the right attitude. The question is this going to harm the community? And if it is, we're not going to do it. And if it's not, then we'll think about it. But this means that there's a lot of thinking that would go into adopting anything at all. And but Berry's been pretty clear about this. We've become a people who cannot think and are unwilling to think, even when we really ought to be thinking long and hard about the things that we decide we're going to use. Now, he says the automobile is an invention of something destructiveness, social destructiveness. And he owns a car. I mean, you're born into a world in which a lot of things are in place before you have any say in the matter. But one of the things he said about the automobile is that he says, I don't know how people who don't have cars are going to be useful to each other, especially rural people, because they live so far apart. But he says they live far apart from each other because of the automobile. So it's not just a solution to a problem; it is the cause of a problem as well. So you're right, it's a high bar, but I think he lives quite comfortably and happily without television and without a second house and a recreational vehicle and a motorboat. Yeah, he's in it. He knows he's in it, but he says that we all should learn to draw a line somewhere. And then once we've drawn that line and lived comfortably behind it, and draw another one.
We talked in our first conversation about Wendell Berry, about his deep roots in farming and what he does on his farm in Kentucky. So he's thought long and hard about how technology has changed farming over the years. How would he argue that it's changed farming in a negative way?
The introduction of a new technology does a couple of things, and he learned some of this from the writer I mentioned in the first episode, John Crow Ransom. So what Ransom said was a labor-saving device, if it's introduced into a human concern, doesn't save labor. It evicts laborers. It kicks people out of the work. And I mean, this is true. I'm sure that there are some things, some technological inventions that actually do create jobs. But for the most part, what happens is they replace people. And then we wonder why we have an unemployment problem and why we have to have safety nets for these people whom we have willingly replaced by invention. So we talked about this previously, but the industrialization of farming meant that one farmer could do the work of 20 or 30 or 40, and that those other 20 or 30 or 40 were free to go find more meaningful work. Well, what if they don't want to do that? What if they wanted to be farmers in the first place? But there's another part to this, which I think is even more interesting, and that is if a technology evicts laborers, if it kicks them out of an enterprise, what it's also going to do is get rid of the knowledge that goes with those people. So let's suppose that all the people who at one time knew how to farm by old means, by old methods, who knew how to drive a team of horses, for example, what happens when all those people are in the grave and then there's not enough energy to run the machines? Now what are we going to do? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to reinvent the wheel, and we're going to get it oblong for a long time until we recover knowledge that we willingly got rid of when we got rid of the people who had that knowledge. So the technological problem in farming is, first of all, that it renders us obsolete. And the second problem is that it eliminates an older form of knowledge that is probably going to be needed again at some point in the future. I've joked with students before, although it's not really a joke. I said, the college professors in the future are going to be Amish farmers because they're going to be the only people who know how to feed themselves.
Would Berry say that the business of agriculture, the large-scale farming, the large-scale agribusiness, is it in fact morally unacceptable?
Well, that's a tough question. He's been careful to say that there are a lot of farmers who are farming according to methods that they would, if they had a choice, they would not be farming by. But they've been given no choice. Mm-hmm. They're not price makers, they're price takers, and they are beholden to the corporations that set prices, and they're beholden to the corporations who are actually laundering the money with government subsidies. So in one respect, I think it's unfair to call it morally wrong, in as much as there's no real freedom that many farmers have been given. On the other hand, of course, it's a kind of blasphemy, he says, to desecrate the goodness of creation. And this, I think, is clearly what industrial farming does. It is destroying the sources we live from. And people say, well, we can't feed the world on older methods. My first response to that is, who said my job is to feed the world? Our job is it is the job of a given place to feed itself, to take care of itself. There might be room for surplus. There might be room for exports, certainly. It's, I think, a fair retort to say you can't feed yourself forever by these means, because when the endowment of topsoil is gone, cloud dusting planes aren't going to drop topsoil on Kansas and replenish it. It's just not going to happen.
Talking with Dr. Jason Peters, Associate Professor of English at Hillsdale College, about Wendell Berry and his writings and thoughts on technology. There's a documentary on Wendell Berry called Look and See. Does this give us a better insight into his life and his thinking on technology?
Yeah, it's a really well done documentary. It may be the only documentary on a man who never appears in the film. He doesn't like the camera, and he doesn't like the medium. But Laura Dunn, the woman who made this, is a really talented filmmaker. And the film really does a good job of showing the desperation of the rural people that Berry's been defending ever since his return in 1964 to his home county in Kentucky. A really good documentary, I think, really worth seeing. I guess I should point out that one of the things that the film can't do, because I don't think it's the sort of thing that film can do, but what Berry's own writing has done is shown the incremental steps that he took on his way to writing that impudent little piece for Harper's, Why I'm Not Going to Buy a Computer. And if you go back and look at the way he worked through some problems of his own, I think you see a very clear, logical, defensible process that got him to that little dissent of his about the computer. For example, when he expanded the size of his farm, he realized that his equipment wasn't equal to the size that the farm now was, and so he was confronted with the problem. Do I buy a used Ford 9N tractor, or do I buy a team of horses? And he worked through it, and he decided to buy the team of horses instead of the Ford 9N. I've driven some Ford 9Ns. They're fun little tractors. They're not as reliable these days as maybe they were in the 1940s and 50s. But, if you don't take the time to go back and look at how he worked through this problem and the reasons that he gave for buying the team instead of buying the tractor, and if you're not willing to go back before that to see some other things that he had to work through, then I think you're going to have a really difficult time making sense of the piece from Harper's.
It sounds like one of the major lessons to be gleaned from Berry is a very simple piece of advice to stop and think and consider consequences that may be seen and unseen in the future before making these decisions?
It must drive the people on the left really crazy because he's got that impulse, which is to say there are going to be some consequences here. Maybe we should stop and think about this. Of course, he's really good at driving people on the right and left crazy, since he's kind of a man without a political party. Although he's kind of a yellow dog Democrat. He was born into the New Deal, but yeah, I say most of us are just sort of we're the kinds of people who will capitulate easily to the next thing. If something shiny goes whizzing by us, we're like a largemouth bass. We go after it and eat it. And then comes the consequence for having done so.
Dr. Jason Peters, Associate Professor of English at Hillsdale College, as we continue our conversations on the American author, writer Wendell Berry, here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Dr. Peters, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Mark Moyar. His brand new book is Masters of Corruption, and Jason Peters from Hillsdale's English Department. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.